Good morning. Welcome to day 2 of the conference. Fortunately for everyone, I'm not moderating. But before I introduce the moderator of this panel, I just wanted to let you all know that Tom Hazlett has some copies of his book, which will be out there if you want them signed. Of course, you have to pay for them, but then he'll sign it for you. The next panel is called Terminally Unconnected, about sort of universal service issues. And it's going to be, I'm going to introduce the moderator and then I'll just sit down. Jonathan Make will be the moderator, and he's the executive editor of newsletter publishing company Warren Communications, which includes Com Daily. He's also worked for Bloomberg News, and he's incoming president of the Society of Professional Journalists in DC. And he claims that he enjoys moderating panels on the media and tech and telecom. And we will ask him after this panel whether that remains to be true.
Thank you, Scott. We'll try not to test that too stringently. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I'm just going to introduce the panelists very quickly. I believe we have John Horrigan, who just joined TPI. No. Yeah. Yes, okay. We have Mark Jamison from the University of Florida. We have Jeff Kohler with Rise Broadband. We have Nicol Turner-Lee with the Brookings Institution, and we have Madura Wijewardena from Comcast. And we'll go straight to it. I encourage people to actually ask questions or at any point, so if you have a question, just stand up and hopefully I'll see you. I just wanted to start, to no panelists in particular, with the title of this panel, which is, will we ever get everyone online? And so I guess the question here is there any foreseeable way that the digital divide and all of its many flavors can be closed anytime soon? Is that a practical medium-term goal?
Well, I'll jump in briefly. From the numbers, we do know that about 90% of Americans say that they're internet users. Where we start to have the discussion about the digital divide is how they're logging on. So we know that about 3/4 of households have a broadband internet connection at home, and that's typically where people start to identify the digital divide as the challenge of getting that final 25% online. In terms of how quickly we can close that gap, I think one thing we've learned over the past 6 or 8 years is that it's a harder problem than I think people anticipated, say 8 or 9 years ago, to get the final cohort of people who do not have broadband at home online. It is typically a sort of a community by community kind of undertaking. If there is a lever to pull to magically get these folks online, we certainly haven't found it. We have, and we can talk about this later, come across some models that are worthwhile in closing the gap, but it's a more protracted process than I think some people appreciate.
Okay. Any other views in the panel?
I'll add on to that a bit. As far as the numbers go, which he touched on, so just to put it in perspective, so there's 34 million Americans that do not have access to high-speed broadband. And if you didn't know, high-speed broadband is defined as a 25 megabit service down and a 3 megabit service up. And of those 34 million out there, 2/3 of them reside in the rural area. So you've got 23 million Americans in the rural areas that do not have access to high-speed broadband. And not having access is part of the problem, but my company, Rise Broadband, we provide broadband services in primarily rural areas where people don't have a lot of choice. But what I see, it's not only just not having access to broadband, but it's also the people that don't have a choice of more than one provider. So there's, of the developed census blocks in the United States, 42% of those blocks and the people living there do not have a choice of more than one provider. And that's where I see, for example, we provide service in 16 states, and we bought 114 of these small companies that provide fixed wireless internet services out there. And it still amazes me when I talk to these folks that you've got people out there charging $90 for a 5 meg service because they are the only service provider that's available. So as far as I'm concerned, not having access is part of the problem, but also to be recognized where there's not choice and where there's not competition, the services that are offered are typically rather stifled and the prices are rather high, and that's something else that we need to work on.
Let me chime in as well, and I'll just challenge the question, because I don't know who "we" is in this. For the most part, all the people who have broadband have done it themselves with their service providers. Service providers put up the money. Customer said, "That's good. I'll pay for some of that," and that is how the process has worked. And if that's "we," that's great, because we know how that system works and it can work well. And our primary question then is, are there barriers to that happening? And so any place that's not happening, that would be our investigation. Is there something that's keeping that from happening? Beyond that, we've failed to do any kind of cost-benefit analysis. Because if we're putting money, if we're talking about taking money from one place, putting it into broadband that people are unwilling to pay for, then we get less housing, we get less food, we get less education, something else is given up. We've never asked the question, is it worth it or not? And I think that actually stands in our way, since we've not rigorously dealt with that.
Yeah, I mean, just to one point, I think there are two issues, I think, and it's important to remember that. There's the deployment issue, which is the access to a network, and then the other piece is the subscription issue, which is the adoption issue. So and I agree with everything that everyone has said so far. You know, there is a difference between urban areas and rural areas. I think there's undeniable that most of the deployment issue is in rural areas. If you look at the most recent data, June 2016 data, which was in a recent FCC report, about 72% of people who reside in rural areas have access to 25/3 from a fixed provider, and if you look at urban areas, it's 98% have access. So the problem, it's very, very clear that the unserved problem is a rural problem. But then we also need to remember I think we need to be realistic. I think the trend lines access has been improving. This is deployment. If you look at even rural areas, I was just looking this morning at the data from the FCC, there's been a 37 percentage point increase in the number of people who have access to 25/3 from a fixed provider in rural areas. That's from 35% in 2011 to 72% in June 2016. So in 4.5 years, it's gone up by 37 percentage points. So I think while we recognize the fact that there are certain people who don't have access, mostly in rural areas, you need to recognize that the free market has been delivering, and it's not like there is stagnation or there is a decline. And this has occurred, I think it's important to remember, this has occurred during a very, very deep recession where capital investment in other places declined. So the trend lines are good, and we still have, as Mark said, and I agree completely with what Mark said, that we need to identify what the drivers are on deployment and then find solutions that actually fit those. On the adoption side, the subscription side, as John said, and his work has sort of guided the way for us, we again need to find out what the drivers are. Why is it that certain people who have access to a fixed network, why are they not subscribing, and then design solutions that address those.
Okay, so I'll just sort of take the comments of my colleagues and sort of put them in this casing that sheds a different perspective on the issue. So I agree with everybody that we are seeing an upward trajectory of broadband access. The availability of broadband has always been key and part of the reason why some people adopt and some people don't. And I think rural has definitely turned out to be sort of our watershed moment. We look at the digital divide crisis in terms of who's not online. But I would actually offer, and this really has stuck with me, data from Pew that says that 13% of Americans are still not online. And they are not just rural residents, right? They are people of color who are disproportionately poor, illiterate. They are older Americans. They are rural residents. They are non-English speaking Americans or immigrants that have come to the country. And I think at this point, and this is sort of goes back to Jonathan, your question, can the digital divide be closed? Or perhaps the title of the session, the terminally unconnected. The challenge of actually asking us the question, can it be closed, is really challenging because it has to be closed. Because that 13% of Americans tend to be impoverished. They tend to be in this trajectory where they cannot break the cycle of poverty, and they need broadband the most. The efficiencies that come from broadband are actually what they are actually missing out on when you look at the digital economy and the sharing economy combined. And so I think we're missing an opportunity to sort of look at this question, rephrasing it from, can it, to why must we work towards actually closing it? Because just to the points of my colleague, the question has become much more critical in the last 25 years as we've talked about this. It's no longer a binary conversation between who's online and who's not offline. And we also know that smartphones have dramatically changed the ecology of how people are accessing the internet as well. So we have that question. But then we have to ask ourselves, is fixed or wireless a substitute for each other? And again, when I look at my research and I go back to that 13% of Americans, I think of the multiplier effects of exclusion that essentially have broader implications for society if we try not to address the problem head on.
Okay, before we drill down to practicalities, maybe we should ask whether it's worth it, monetarily, and I suppose for the societal and other, economic benefits to, again, fully close the digital divide. And Mark, maybe you want to start.
Well, my comment before was we don't know. We've never actually engaged that question. We've never studied if someone receives subsidized broadband, what's the benefit to them? We've not studied that. We've not studied what are the opportunity costs of the money involved. I've been involved in telecommunications for a very long time, and one of the things, and I helped put together to a certain extent, I was a little bit late in the game, the whole Lifeline program. And one thing that has struck me in studying it over the years is that it didn't make any difference. Giving people we give telecom companies a subsidy if they sign up low-income customers. And that the studies I've been able to do and those that I've seen say that most of the people who sign up for it actually already have service, and so it's an income subsidy to them. So that's effectively what we're doing. So why not provide the income subsidy and let them make their choices as to what they will do with it instead of prescribing what they will do with it?
Or what else you can do is, which the FCC is doing right now, and they're trying to be very aggressive with it. They're providing the subsidy not so much to the end user, but they're providing the subsidy to the operator that can build the network that can allow the person to make that choice. So they've got the alternative Connect America Fund model, and they've got the Connect America funds, and they have Connect America Fund 2 and CAF Phase 2, and they've put out probably all told, maybe about $10 billion or something like that to enable operators to build in areas that you normally would never serve because it's just not economically viable to build networks in those areas. So they are trying to address that subsidy issue also by getting to the operator, but by the same token, if you've got 30 million people that don't have access to high-speed broadband, I think maybe it solves 20% of the problem, maybe 30% of the problem, I'm not sure. It still leaves a lot of people out there that aren't going to have access to the higher speed. And the funny thing about adoption too, so we participate in this CAF program, Connect America Fund program, is called the Rural Broadband Experiment. So we got $17 million to build networks, 10 networks in places that were deemed unserved. And the funny thing that I've noticed about adoption rates is it follows density of the population and it follows income. And so if you look at your lowest quartile of income and your lowest quartiles of population density, you're only going to find the adoption rate being something in the low teens for high-speed broadband. When you flip it up to the other side, you'll find 3-4-fold increases in adoption rates. And so we've only been at this rural broadband experiment program for a little while. We're like 25-30% of the network is built out in these 10 areas. And the take rates are lower than I would have expected. So the FCC said you have to build a network that you have to assume 70% of the people are going to jump all over this because you're the only person there. And so after about a year providing service to portions, the portions we've built out, we've got take rates in the mid-single digits to maybe 10%, and I'm scratching my head about this, and we have 850 employees, and so I get on the phone, I'm talking to our salespeople, I was like, why aren't more people, jumping all over this? Because I thought it would be, we go out there, we're in rural Nebraska, we knock on the door, and, we say, we're here, we're here with your 25/5 service, and, and they're like, sort of like, well, who sent you? And you say, well, the government did, sir. Slam, door slam. So, but these are people that probably don't own computers, and they probably don't own tablets, and they probably subscribe to a satellite video service, so they don't need to be a cord cutter, and I don't think they quite understand what broadband can do for them, nor do I think a lot of people can actually afford it, even once you get in there and build the network. I suppose they get there over time, but it seems like a fairly slow adoption rate for a lot of these really rural people.
Good. And then we'll go to Nicole. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, a point to Mark's question. We haven't answered all the questions that Mark posed, but we have learned some things about broadband adoption over the past several years. A couple years back, I did some work studying recent Comcast Internet Essentials customers, low-income people who took the Comcast discounted service offer. And what I found looking at that customer base is that training does make a difference on how to use the internet in getting people to use it for purposes like education or job search. And that goes a little bit to the point Jeff was just making, which was his company experienced the they built it but they did not come kind of phenomenon. If you study new internet users, you get a feel that can go on, but if they have the opportunity to get some training on how to use the internet, to understand what it can be useful for them in their lives, they start to use it more robustly and for purposes that might improve their life outcomes. We haven't figured out whether it in fact does that or not, but we've at a minimum learned that training makes a difference, and really running more experiments to see how that affects people over time are well worth doing.
Yeah, and I would say, I think out of the conversation we're having, one critical thing that has not come out of all of our mouths is the relevance of broadband, right? There are still people, and this is a huge factor, we still have, marketplace competition that comes up as one of the variables, the prohibitive factor of cost for some people. In fact, Pew ran a study in May that said, and I wrote it down because I wanted to share it because I haven't heard the stat, 84% of rural residents who make over $75,000 have a home broadband connection and a smartphone.
I think
So-
it's great that Nicole's quoting all my Pew stuff,
I am.
and I'm not bothering to. So thank
You're
you.
not there, right?
Yeah.
Somebody had to do a job,
Yeah, thank
right?
you.
So part of the challenge, I think, when we look at income, because we tend to make these homogenous big boxes, well, if you live rural, you don't have access. I think your point is well taken. But we have to go back and sort of understand, for people who are at the bottom echelon of income, what's stopping them from getting online? Obviously, relevance is one of those factors, and we have to do a better job sort of amplifying the benefit of having broadband. Let's start there. I wanted to take the example of Lifeline, for example. When we modernize Lifeline to have broadband access, the hope and the goal is that we'll see more people get online. But again, if we look at these disparities, why would people not get there? There's one thing to throw broadband at people and say, here's a connection. There's another thing to say to a person, you need this connection to get a job, to apply for government benefits, to apply for housing. One of the areas that we've always bounced off, or I've bounced off in my prior work at MMTC and now Brookings, is when you look at the Lifeline benefit of $9.95, for example, what if content that allowed people to look for jobs or healthcare, et cetera, was sort of zero rated or free, provisioned for free, so that people can get access to those benefits and see that I not only have a Lifeline connection just because it's a subsidized cost of broadband, but it actually is giving me a pathway, an on-ramp to get to those services that I need the most that are going to sort of help me understand the relevance of broadband. I think as we move forward with this debate, it's really important to sort of piece those things together, because the debate has always landed up with us throwing Post-it notes up on the table and sort of having this fractured cow that is in bits and pieces without looking at the totality of the problem that we're trying to solve for these groups that are offline. So I think that's one example, as well as targeted investments. When we look at high-cost investments or universal service fund, where are we placing the dollars to maximize the cost? Do we want to build in places where they're primarily farms, or do we want to get to, those folks that are at the 15% level of income in rural America that do not have access? That's probably a wiser use of our expenses to actually help us move beyond this particular dialogue.
Sure, go ahead.
Just on I think it's important to sort of remember the two silos, the deployment piece, which is very, very different. And as I mentioned earlier, the private enterprise with some government support through the CAF and the high cost fund has been delivering. The trend line is upwards at a time when elsewhere it's been some very tough times. On the adoption piece and the program that John mentioned, which is the Comcast Internet Essentials program, which is in our footprint. Our footprint is deployed for broadband at roughly 99 to 100%. So, and we're predominantly an urban company, so some of the issues that Jeff mentioned in rural areas are quite different in urban areas. But if you look at our program, we've started that in mid-2011, and we just announced a few weeks ago the results, and we've connected roughly 4 million people, 1 million households in our footprint, and it's available to families with at least one child in the school lunch program. And what we have found is that for us to get to that level, which kind of goes to everyone's point so far, and also what Mark said about whether people actually, what's the sort of the relative value of broadband access compared to these other things. What we found is that in order to have an impact, it's a very, very slow process. It's taken us from 2011 to now to get to that level of subscriptions. And we also found that the sort of the beginning phase was difficult because we had to learn from people. We're in the business of providing broadband access. I mean, that's one of our core products. But when you get to this community, which has many, many other sort of structural issues related to poverty and education and other things, there is no turnkey solution. So we found that, and as John said, that to make it relevant, relevance is a key point, but also dealing with cost and also dealing with access to a computer, because we provide all three of those, a low-cost access to the access piece, and then a low-cost computer, and then a full suite of digital literacy training. We found that not to sort of ram it down people's throats, but to gain some interest, you need to address all three of those, and it's a slow process. And we found that over time, we've sort of gotten better at it. For example, in the first 6 months of 2017, we connected more people than in any other 6-month period. So we've been getting better at it, but it's taken a lot of time, and it's taken a lot of time working with community partners. We have about 9,000 which we deliver this program through. So we take the view that we don't know how to solve these problems, so we have to work with people. So the point that I'm trying to make is that I think people often sort of come up with these sort of grand ideas about how to solve this problem. I think there is no grand idea. There is no turnkey solution. And our experience over these years has shown that the best way to do it is to not just focus on the subsidy piece, which is, I think, what Mark said. We need to address the other pieces too, training being a key one. And then we need to deliver it through the community partners that we go through. We cannot just, for this product, unlike a regular product, this sort of regular advertising doesn't work. And the final point is, even in our sort of regular product, the HSD, the high-speed data product that we have, in our footprint, and you can look at our financials for this, about 40%, I think just 41, 42 these days, of homes that we connect to actually subscribe to our product. So that shows the level of competition, and that shows how difficult it is to get people to sign on, because the other folks who don't subscribe through us in our footprint go with AT&T, Verizon, and whoever else. So it's even for a company that's in the business of selling broadband, dealing with this problem is not an easy solution. So I think you should be sort of careful about buying into any ideas that, if you solve the subsidy problem, it'll be fixed, or if you solve the training problem, it'll be fixed. It's a mix of things, and I think our success in bringing together a sort of a holistic wraparound solution that we have done so sort of with commitment, and it's a permanent commitment on our part, and it's a slow progress, but I think that's how you deal with it. That doesn't mean that the problem's going to get solved, because I think there will be, as Mark was saying, there will be some people who just decide not to.
Can I chime in?
Sure. Then we'll go to the next question. Sure.
Let me compliment the work that's being talked about here. And mentioning CAF, what the FCC has been doing. When I was involved as a regulator many, many years ago, the things we did on universal service were largely a waste of money. What the FCC has done now in trying to get some competition for the subsidies has been a remarkable improvement. And the things that people have talked about here is about, you know, are customers ready for it? What will they do with it, et cetera, are really very critical questions. Whenever I speak with an audience about what's the best practice in dealing with broadband issues, I always point to Trinidad and Tobago. Because what they have done is the regulator and the companies as well go find areas that aren't served. They study, are these people ready for broadband? If they're not, you know, who needs to be involved? It's a lot of times it's the industry being involved, preparing them because they have a strong incentive because they want to market their products. Sometimes it may be the educational institutions, but they deal with the readiness issues. Then the access issues, this is what we talk about with the reverse auctions and such as that, but also teasing that apart and saying, well, what makes this not commercially viable? Is it just people haven't had enough time to deploy the network? If that's the issue, it'll get deployed. Or is it just not commercially viable? And then is it a capital issue or is it an operating expense issue? And then what's the real applications and use once they're done? And taking that much more holistic approach, working with industry, working with the other institutions, seems to work really, really well.
Can I say on that too?
All right, then we'll move on
Okay,
after.
just
Go
real
ahead,
quick.
Nicole, and then we'll move
We
on.
loved that second question. That was good.
Yeah, right. Just real quick.
I'm not through with it either.
Well, I would say on Mark's point, I mean, I think one opportunity that we're actually sitting on is an inventory of all of the public-private sector partnerships that are happening now. I mean, you have Comcast that just celebrated a very huge milestone in their program. You have T-Mobile that has a smartphone solution that has come out. You have AT&T that has a solution that has come out. You have Charter that has a solution, Google, et cetera. And one of the ways that we can maybe begin this conversation is what is the data, what are the metrics, what are the successes, where are there best practices that are happening? When I think about these programs, I'd love to see a national map that shows where all these programs are actually operating. And can we actually look at what communities are being covered, what communities are not being covered, to maybe put together a toolkit that allows us to move away from duplication of services or to get at some of these bottom line questions. And I think, Mark, to your point, that's something that we're sitting on now that's not readily available to all of us to sort of understand the problem.
I've got students that would love that data.
Yeah, right. I'd love that data.
Let me just, I want to drill down just a little more in the practicalities, then we'll kind of move on. A number of things have been identified now, which is great in terms of practical solutions. If I'm understanding what Madura said right, he said one thing that works in terms of helping to close the digital divide is low-cost service, providing training, and also providing a device. I've heard Internet Essentials is a program, some of the FCC programs, Connect America Fund, and training. So those are some practical things we've listed. You know, if anyone can leap in with other, since there is no inventory or map of, you know, here's where this is and you know, here's the success rate, what are the other things that are missing that have been shown to work?
What can I? Oh, go ahead, John.
I'll quickly chime in with network effects, meaning Jeff was talking about how his adoption rate rises with density and income. Research has shown that if you have a lot of broadband adopters around you in your social network, you're more likely to get broadband yourself. Very common sense point, but it works at the low income levels for the hardest to reach. So we have this wonderful network technology that many people would like to get to a greater share of Americans. Use the technology itself to virally spread the word within communities to overcome a big barrier to adoption, which is trust. Are these folks going to Jeff's point, trust somebody knocking on the door and saying, I got broadband for you, and they're going to be, what? But if they hear from somebody in the community that they trust, a neighbor, et cetera, that makes a real big difference.
Okay.
Yeah, you know, and from a technology standpoint, it seems that, you know, it really takes a village to solve the problems of getting people connected. We all know an all-fiber diet isn't healthy and it's very expensive. You've got fixed wireless solutions, mobile wireless solutions, you've got cable, you've got copper, and it's really not a one-size-fit-all type of thing. And so I like what the FCC is doing right now, as a matter of fact, is that they are looking at alternate technologies. And you know what, maybe we shouldn't just, fund the price cap carriers only to do this type of work. They've got a fresh set of eyes working there, and I think that's really going to help solve that problem. And as far as the adoption goes, we have noticed too, I mean, just put it in perspective, our average customer uses about 120 gigabytes of data a month. The recent mobile carrier poll from last year said their average customer uses 4 gigabytes of data per month. So huge disparity why a fixed service is so much different than a mobile service. You basically can't afford to have a mobile service in your home to do the things that people normally do on the internet, or you'd be paying $1,000 a month, or you could just pay your fixed provider $50 or $60 a month for the same type of service. So I do think as long as we make the service available to people, maybe they are slower adopters, maybe they don't think they want it now, but I do think we need to have the infrastructure out there, and infrastructure can be laying the cable, laying the fiber, it could be having access to the towers or the municipal poles to deliver a wireless service to the home. But if you make those, I think we have to make those things at least available to people, and they will come because they do eat the dog food once they start using it and understand it.
Yep, related to what John and Nicole were saying earlier, about language network effects, there was a really good study done by James Prager at Pepperdine a few years ago, where he looked at the effects of language. And he found that once communities of Spanish speakers started signing up, it grew very fast. According to that, we've got a community that's interested. And I think that then gets to a lesson that I learned a long time ago, and some of you are old enough to remember this, some of you not. We had, back in the Clinton-Gore administration, the National Information Infrastructure Initiative. And what that did for us was it had a national conversation that said the future is nothing like the past, and we have to leap forward. And I think just that conversation was very effective. It changed how the regulators were thinking about telecommunications, changed how the companies were thinking about it, and taking that down to a community level, I think, is probably very beneficial.
So, okay, Jeff, I have to say this. So I don't think we should compare it to dog food. Just, I had to get that off my conscience. I don't think, having broadband is like eating dog food, because I don't eat my dog's food, right? I think, going forward, the challenge that we have is, I think everybody has said it, it's not a one-size-fits-all. And I think we've actually imposed these artificial goals, like we're going to get broadband to everybody's home. Maybe we should restructure the question and say, we're going to get to everybody's home, to everybody's hip, to everybody's library or public space where they convene, and have that as a short-term goal, just to ensure that we're actually meeting the critical crisis of people being offline. I mean, a lot of people have it on their hip. Some people can't have it in their home, as we've talked about, we're rural, because the fiber backhauls not there. So let's get realistic, folks, right, in terms of what we can actually do and create more short-term goals because of what the effects are. I think when we start looking at this issue, and I kind of want to push our group because many of us have been talking about this for many, many years, I think we need to go to the source. That's why I say it's not dog food. It's really a nutrient that's going to make sure people are included in the economic fiber of this country, right? We have to look at having digital access as an economic output. The future of work is going to be determined by people's ability to actually get into the game. And if they don't have access at the hip, in the library, the school, or in their home, they're going to continuously be left out of that game. They won't have anything to survive on because they won't be able to be trained up, to accommodate the future of automation and all the things that we've talked about at the conference. And we also have to think of, I think to everybody's agreement up here, government should not play a role in sort of building out these networks in the way that it's been debated, and we're not going to bring other words to this conversation. But it's important that we streamline some of the efficiencies that government can bring to people so that they can see the value and relevance, again, of having this technology to work, to education, to healthcare. And I think that's where we sort of get stuck. Is it about, like you said, when my people knock on the door and people say, I don't need it, are they really making a future-proof decision around their choice to access broadband, right? I think most people would say, I don't need it because, there's things that my grandchildren go on that I don't want to go on. That's not really the question here. And those folks will continuously be left behind, and we won't be able to count on them for our competitiveness going forward. So with the FCC, I like the programs in a way we're starting to think about the deployment issue in a much more economic way. The gigabyte opportunity zones is another way that we're sort of looking at that. But John, to your point, I think we need to change the equation on how we look at this.
Well, I think you make a good point. I want to make just an editorial point, and then we'll see if we have any questions, and if not, we'll move on, and which dovetails off of what Nicol said, which is whether it's government or private sector, academics, a mix of all those. One thing that kind of seems clear to me, just listening to the panelists' comments, is there's not necessarily an organizing, one organizing principle, one set of best practices, one inventory, one map. A lot of this is fractured, bifurcated. And that's one of my takeaways. Any questions from the audience? Yes, ma'am. Right in the front. Don't know.
Okay, I'm just going to try to talk and see if so my question to you is this: at the peak of television penetration in the bundle in 2013, there were 114 million homes, and 100 million homes had access to any television. 14 million homes had no rabbit ears, no television of any kind, no. And so Nielsen just measured the 100 million homes because the other people didn't have TV. So that's about a 12%, that's sort of like a 12% of people who just said, I don't want to be mainstream. I don't even want a television. 50 years after cable TV had started. So if 13% of people don't have broadband, I guess my best question is, could it be that in a society of individuals of 330 million, 13% of them just don't want to be connected to the internet for a bunch of reasons maybe you're running into. But why is it we think that zero, everyone has to have the internet?
Well, let me just start with a number. The 13% is the share of people who do not use the internet. It's 25%, maybe a little bit more, of people who do not have a broadband subscription at home. So that does change the gap substantially, and we do know that some portion of that 25% would likely get broadband if the cost was within their income range, if they understood the relevance, if they had some training. I would not say that zero is a feasible answer in even the medium or long term, but my sense of just being around this discussion for a while is that a lot of stakeholders see that 25% to 1/3 as too great of a number of people not having a broadband subscription at home.
And to your point, so if you look at I do agree, I don't think it's going to be a zero-sum game that everybody will be offline, because there will be people, I don't want to say my mother because she's online now too much, but there will be people that actually do not prefer to use the connection for a variety of reasons. But I think to your point, even with television, if you go back to the number of people that didn't use TV, and you look at, the things that they were missing, from natural disasters to others, it's sort of the same thing, Laura, when it comes to the people that are currently not offline. It would be different if the people that are not offline, at least some portion of the percentage that John described, were wealthy individuals, right? Or people who had the privilege of saying, I can have a connection, I don't have a connection. But these are some, this is Michael Harrington's Other America. These are some of the poorest people in our society that are not getting access for whatever reason or shying away from the access. And if you look at the costs on the other side of those folks on the margin, it's much greater than sort of throwing our hands up and saying we won't connect them. So I completely agree with the television analogy, and I think about the things that we missed out when we didn't have a television in our home that were going on around us. Just switch that and substitute it with not having a broadband connection and the various verticals of benefit that you're actually not, you're missing out on.
If I could chime in, I've not studied why a household might or might not choose fixed broadband versus mobile. We did do it for telephone service at our research center, and we found out that, at least in Florida, for the low-income households, a lot of them did not want a fixed line. They did not want it because, one, they moved often. There were a lot of people in and out the house. They could not control access to it. There was another reason why it slipped my mind. Mobile served them much better, or going someplace else served them much better. So it's not a foregone conclusion that they would actually want it. But we want to give them the choice, I think.
That's right.
And I think we tend to think, we keep talking about adoption, all this. I think we tend to speak in terms of high-speed broadband, the definition 25/3, that sort of thing. But when you look at people that have access to online services at lower speeds, like 4 megabits per second, it's low single-digit % of people don't have access to at least that. So these people have something, and if all you're going to do is check your email, 4 megabits is fine. In fact, there's very few people out there that need more than 15 or 20 megabits. I'd say 90% of the population is absolutely satisfied with that. So it is available, just not on the high speed
Just
side.
from our point of view, and I agree, Laura, that there will be people who don't want to subscribe. So what we've taken, our approach has been with Internet Essentials, which targets this community, is to provide them. We strongly believe that the solution is to offer a holistic solution, so it deals with the cost issue, deals with the access to a computer, which is a big one too. So we provide a subsidized computer, and then the full suite of training online and in person. Our hope is that when that holistic solution is offered, that some of these people will take on. And we found that through experience, we found that the only way that's going to happen is if we deliver that through trusted partners. We've got about 9,000, and some of the best have been the school districts. Chicago is the best example of that, because if you get something in the mail from Comcast saying if you have a kid in the school lunch program, you can access these services, they probably wouldn't believe it. But if it goes through a school district, if it goes through a trusted community partner, then people tend to believe that. So we think that, and the research and John's and Mark's Regis has shown, is that this community has a sort of particular roadblocks that we need to get through, and what we've tried to do is to learn from that research, to design it, and then continue to change it. And on the mobile piece, one of the things that we've done is that just 2 weeks ago we announced, the Internet Essentials customers get access to, it's not just the access, but we get a Wi-Fi router, but we announced just 2 weeks ago that they will also get access to our 18 million Xfinity Wi-Fi, which is outside the home. So if you're traveling anywhere in the Comcast footprint, these customers will get access to that, which means that their cell phone can be offloading to Wi-Fi, and we offer 40 hours of free access. So it's that continuous improvement. I think what we have found as a broadband provider is that the regular sort of the marketing does not work. We need to go figure out some other ways, but recognize that at the end of the day, it's these individuals who will decide, and we cannot sort of ram it down their throats, and there will be people who don't want to do it. But we have found that the other piece is by linking it to education, we have made it more relevant to people, and our objective has always been to get people who have not signed up. It's not a subsidy program, it's been to get people who have not signed up, and we found that by linking it to education, and we track customer satisfaction, we track how much the service is being used for education, and we found that like 98% of our customers on this program say that they've used it for education. I think the number is about 80% have said that they have used it, both the training and the access piece, to apply for a job or to gain a job. So our view is that there are many, 1,000 flowers can bloom, but that there are many ways of addressing this, but that holistic nature is important, and it does take time. It's a slow process.
Okay, we'll kind of go the lightning round for questions. In the middle, maybe that's Diane, if I recognize you. Yes.
With MOOCs, one of the arguments for MOOCs was that you would have all these people who didn't have access to education who would be able to take the class and learn. And 97% of the people who signed up for MOOCs never completed the first homework. And my argument to people who organized MOOCs was that if they had read Sennett and Cobb's 1978 book, The Hidden Injuries of Class, they never would have even come up with the idea of MOOCs. That what we really have to think about is that when you're a lower income individual, you've spent a whole lifetime being socialized to have a certain idea of what your self-worth is. And so I'm just kind of curious, I'm not surprised that when you put it in, that they didn't sign up. I'm not surprised that regular marketing doesn't work. And I'm thinking you don't need a technological solution here, you need a sociological solution. Like you should have teams of sociologists who go out and work with communities. Yes. I mean, is that something that you think about?
So just so we can get to
That's
the,
what keeps that's what keeps sociologists like me employed, you're right.
So for us, that's right. I mean, that's what the research that, when we designed this program, we did use the sociological research like John did at the National Broadband Plan. And on the education piece, one of the ways that we've tried to do it is, one of the big partners for us is the Khan Academy. And we use to provide targeted training for our customers on the types of things that they need. So I think the holistic, to be very, very quick, the holistic solution that I've talked about is incorporating the sociological research, that you need to have some connection, you need to have the content designed in a way that is applicable to the particular community that we're looking at, and goes to the point again that just having a low-cost solution is not going to do it for this community. You do need these other pieces, which I think we've learned from the kind of research that you've mentioned.
okay, Richard in the back.
Yeah, I've got a question for Jeff about difficulties in marketing in rural areas. Like, all the people that you would be trying to sell to presumably would have access to satellite TV and probably mobile broadband. DirecTV offers bundles with the satellite internet providers. So do you guys have any sort of bundle that you offer with TV and or phone to make it more appealing to these guys?
Right, so we do provide, with the broadband service, there's a digital voice service, there's a VoIP service. So you can get your telephone service and your broadband service. We also offer a bundle of Dish and Direct video services. And we actually have a reseller agreement also with Exceed Satellite, because with wireless and the way spectrum propagates, you can't always make a connection to the home sometimes. So we like to have an alternative if their only alternative is like a 1 or 2 meg service over the copper line. So we do offer that. But of course, satellite, for example, is always going to be your last choice, because although their speeds are getting a little bit better with the new birds that they've put up, the capacity constraints in satellite, and you've got a customer using 120 gigabytes a month, there's your $800,000 bill again, so it just doesn't make sense. So it's truly a last resort, but we will make that available to them. But 65% of the broadband traffic is video, and half of that is Netflix. And so there's a lot of cord cutters, and there's a lot of people that just don't need the video service anymore.
All right, we'll make Michael the last question. Really appreciate the questions. These are all good. I'm sorry we're probably not getting to all of them. So go ahead if he was asking one.
Yeah, Michael Calabrese, New America. I also have a question for Jeff and for anyone else, on the low population density problem, because that seems to be the nub to a great degree. To the extent we believe that high-speed broadband is important to education and other opportunities, it seems we're caught somewhat between, on the one hand, wireline fiber gets so expensive in the low density, and on the other hand, mobile is not there yet. As I think it was mentioned, Jeff said his average user is his average household is 122 gigabytes a month. IGR just put out a study, it's 190 gigabytes average monthly. And AT&T's unlimited, both of their unlimited plans cap at 22 gigabytes, for example, more than 100 gigabytes less. So mobile's not there yet as a true alternative. So I'm wondering if, even putting aside financial subsidies, which a number of the panelists don't like to see from the government, what about better spectrum policy to make more, to open some more bands for sharing, where fixed wireless could have wide channels and provide high capacity as a wireless substitute, as a fiber substitute.
Right.
Wireless fiber.
So that's a good point on the cost of deployment. So a fiber home pass, I don't know, $1,500. Maybe in rural areas it costs $2,000. In a fixed wireless environment, network cost is probably like $250 a home. So it's exponentially less expensive to do that. But our highway and our conduit to connecting the home is going to be the type of spectrum that we use. And so low band spectrum can shoot farther, and it propagates through trees and obstructions better, so we can provide a better service. And not that you follow spectrum or anything, but things that start with the numbers 2s and 3s in the gigahertz for spectrum is really the prime grade spectrum for us to deliver an LTE grade. If you want 100 megabit service, you're going to have 100 megabit service. And having access to that, it's actually very difficult because the ones that starts in the 2s, like the 2.5 gigahertz or the 2.3s are controlled by the mobile carriers, the Sprints and the AT&Ts, so we have very little access to that. We are deploying in this 365 spectrum right now, and we're doing 50 and 100 megabit plans to people that were probably used to 4 megabits, so it's making a percentage of that population extremely happy. But having access to those lower mid-bands, I guess I'd call it, in the 3s is very important. And the FCC actually is making another 100 megahertz of spectrum available. If you've heard the term CBRS, Citizens Band Radio Service, that's coming out maybe end of this year, next year, that is great LTE grade spectrum for us to get good connection rate and good speeds to people. And they're doing this on a shared basis. This is Department of Defense spectrum. And they have figured out a way to share the spectrum so people like us and others can use that spectrum to deliver a service. And then there's another band of spectrum just right above it, right next to it, 3.7 to 4.2, which we hope will open up in the next couple of years. Again, very prime grade spectrum. And there's already a global ecosystem for the equipment because it's used all over the world. And the equipment is not very expensive, and it's very high performing, and that would tack on great to what we're using in this, and will use in the CBRS band. And so I applaud any of those efforts that they're thinking with an open mind, and the spectrum sharing idea is, I think, going to work great for wireless providers.
All right, speaking of applause, let's give our excellent panelists a round of applause. Truly sorry we have to stop now. Great questions from the audience, and Jeff Herbst, I believe, is next.